Welcome to the shadow expressions of Mercury in the natal chart. I'm Jessica DeRuzza, and I am a depth psychotherapist and archetypal astrologer. I've been doing counseling astrology since 2007, and I've been a psychotherapist for the last 14 years. So I am bringing in today everything that I've seen over the years, working with clients about what the shadow expression of the planet Mercury looks like in one's natal chart. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and talk about Mercury paired with every other planet in our solar system and bring in that depth psychology awareness into how this can express and manifest itself in a person's life. I first want to start by saying this isn't something I typically do. Usually, I give a pretty well-rounded take on every planetary archetype and combination. But today, I just woke up and I felt super called to talk about the shadow expression because I think it's really important in our work with astrology and looking at it both from an archetypal and depth psychological place, because it's one of the things that becoming self-aware does for us is it allows us to gain greater awareness, compassion, and insight around how the shadow it manifests in the human condition. So I first want to start by describing what I mean by shadow expression, and then I'm going to go into the examples. Thank you so much for being here with me. All right, let's go on this journey together. So when I say shadow expression, what I mean is the shadow expression of a planetary archetype refers to its unconscious, distorted, or unintegrated manifestations, often showing up as reactivity, projections, or imbalance. So what we know is that every planetary pair has a range of archetypal expression from light to shadow. That's one way we can categorize that spectrum. And when we learn astrology, one of the things that we learn is about our shadow, because astrology affords us the ability through a certain kind of dramatic distancing from our own psyche and psychology, and that as well of others, to look at the potential shadow expression of our chart, because there is a universal, non-personal shadow expression to every planet and every planetary combination, and the same is true for every sign and every house. And what I'm really underlining here is that it's universal, right? And therefore, it's also not personal. However, because human beings are having a deeply subjective, feeling-based experience, of course, we experience life personal, as we should. But one thing that we can do when it comes to astrology and looking at a chart is practice the art of depersonalization in order, I think, to take greater levels through awareness, accountability, and responsibility for the potential shadowy ways that every single one of us can express. So let's begin by looking at Mercury with the Sun, and then we'll work our way out to Mercury with Pluto. Again, I'm going to be focusing on the shadow expression when it is distorted or unintegrated, when we're projecting, again, when there's that imbalance. Okay, here we go. When we remember that astrology affords us a cosmic mirroring of our psyche, we need to remember that the psyche includes the unconscious. And this is really, really important in all of our process of growth and healing, is when we come from that premise, it immediately allows us to take a kind of radical responsibility for our lives. And I just think that this world would be such a better place if each of us did our small part in doing that. So this is in service of that. The sun with Mercury in major aspect, especially the hard aspects, but in major aspect with the sun in its shadow expression, is someone who is unable to see the difference between their opinion and fact, that they become so identified with their ideas and their thoughts that they think that their subjective experience is objective reality, that what they're perceiving to be true for themselves or for the world is true for everybody, or is the truth, capital T. So Sun Mercury people can be highly opinionated and at times go blind or unconscious to the way that they're interpreting reality is actually coming from their opinion or their bias that is being distorted through their own personal experience, their limited biography, perhaps their privilege, a blindness to the ways in which their experience does not apply to every other human being. So there's a tendency with Sun Mercury to project our internal experience out onto the external world, including the other people in our lives, and thinking that we know best. Sometimes Sun Mercury people are know-it-alls because they're so identified with the mind. They're so identified with their ideas or their education or their learning or their knowledge that they can come across as stating things in such a declarative way that, again, they think that what they're saying is truth with a capital T or is totally factual or right. So sometimes there can be more of a tendency to be right and a kind of needing to pontificate, needing to get up on a soapbox, needing to go on with these monologues. This you can see happen when the Sun Mercury person is unconscious, when the Sun Mercury person is dysregulated. That's another way to understand how the shadow can come through for all of us, is when our nervous system is dysregulated, we're more prone to the shadow expression of ourselves and of our chart and the aspects in our chart. So when we are upset, when we are overwhelmed, when we're exhausted or fatigued, when we're depressed, when we're anxious, we are more prone to express the shadow side. And so with Sun Mercury, there can be a tendency to stop listening and to just need to do all the talking, or kind of isolating in a kind of myopic place of getting into this little thought bubbles or little bubbles of a world where there's this tendency to kind of enclose or envelop oneself in one's thoughts and ideas to the point where there's no longer that dialogical, relational, in give and take going on. Okay. Now I want to move into the moon with Mercury in its shadow expression. This is someone where there's a tendency to conflate one's emotions and feelings with one's perception of self and others. So if someone is having a feeling about a person or a feeling about a situation that hasn't been processed through yet, there's a tendency to project one's internal emotional landscape or feeling reactivity response to the situation and think that that is what is going on, that their feelings dictate and override at times their perception of reality and their perception of, you know, reading the room and reading the relational dynamics or reading other people. There's a tendency to get confused on the difference between what is that person's emotions and feelings versus what is the other. So when they're in relationship, they sometimes can project their inner emotional state onto the other and not see clearly the difference between the two people's emotional truths or experiences. Moon Mercury also sometimes can do the opposite, where there's this splitting between the mind and logos, and one's intellect, and then one's psychosomatic experience of one's body and one's feelings and one's emotions. And so there can be a split between the mind and the body, or an over intellectualization of one's feelings. So the way that this might show up in the therapeutic space, or this might show up in any kind of healing space, is the Moon Mercury person has a tendency to intellectualize their emotions. They might be really good at talking about what they think they're feeling, but a more challenging time dropping into the body and emoting, and actually just being in the kind of more raw or primal experience of the feeling space. So going into crying, or going into potentially sadness or grief. It's like you can say, like, I'm sad, or, I feel this, but the actual emoting of those feelings or the releasing of those feelings can be more challenging. Mercury in the chart, in its shadow form, can be a over intellectualization of whatever it touches in the chart. So one could be even very articulate or even hyper verbal around the other planet it touches, but a more challenging time in a kind of more, and I mean this in a non-derogatory way, a primitive state of being, where we're more in the primary sensory experience, in this case, of the feelings and the emotions. This Mercury moon sometimes can also be the aspect of someone who has a tendency to gossip or talk about other people's personal lives and personal situations. Mercury likes to talk about whatever it touches, and the moon is the focus on other people, their private lives, what's going on in the home, what's going on in their relationships. So sometimes it can be a kind of gossipy energy, or the kind of over focus or fascination on other people, and less of an ability to focus on and process and talk about what is vulnerable for that person and going on for them. Okay, Mercury with Venus. A lot of people see this as such a lovely aspect, and though it can be, to do justice to its shadow expression, I think it's important that we take in the fact that there can be something quite superficial about Mercury Venus, where there can be a vanity in talking about things that are more kind of focused on image, like only talking about the good things or the beautiful things or the lovely things or the things that project an aura of everything's good. And so this tendency to sugarcoat, this tendency to even bypass over things that are challenging or that are difficult, a harder time going in and talking about real life problems or your real life situation and what's going on. So there can be a fakeness to it, or a pretending. There can also be a people pleasing, where we know that people pleasing isn't actually kindness, it's self abandonment. And so there can be a tendency to self abandon in the Mercury Venus in order to people please and appear to be nice or appear to be kind, when really there are acts of omission in there around one's truth, around what they're actually thinking. And so Mercury Venus in that kind of people pleasing or vanity or sugarcoating can project a sense of everything's all good, it's fine, we're great, when really maybe behind the scenes there's quite a bit of suffering or problems going on. Another shadow side of Mercury Venus are white lies, dishonesty, leaving out parts of the story in order to keep the peace or not rock the boat. There's an over kind of caretaking of trying to manage the other person having a good or positive experience at the expense of honesty. Shadow side of Mercury Mars. Mercury Mars can be very combative and someone who tends to be argumentative, and someone who tends to focus on conflict and want to kind of pick a fight with whoever they're talking with. I notice in couples, the way that sometimes this can manifest is the Mercury Mars shows up as being really competitive in the conversations or the dialogues between the two people. So it's more focused again on like being right or winning the argument at the expense of maintaining healthy, safe connection and emotional connection with the partner. We know that competition isn't really the place for it isn't in our marriage, it's or in our partnerships. Competition is reserved for consensual competitive things like competitive sports or playing a board game or a card game, or if you decide you want to be competitive with your partner because it's game night or because you're playing uh basketball or whatever it is, or you're making these playful bets, that's one thing. But to in the everyday or the mundane or the day to day bring in this competitive scorekeeping. You see this a lot with Mercury and Mars, like keeping a tally, like, well, I did this and they didn't do that. Or I did the dishes way more times than they did, or I do more chores than they do. So it's this tallying and this wanting to prove that someone's right and someone's wrong. You see this a lot in the aspects of lawyers. And so what we want to remember when it comes to our chart is when there are those tendencies, in this case with the Mercury Mars, to be argumentative or to be competitive or to be very driven in proving one's thoughts to be true, is to channel it into a domain of life that is well suited for that, like having a career where you can channel that Mercury Mars and you can take it to work and it serves you. And then when you come home, you can put it down. You can lay your sword down. You can lay your armor down. Mercury Mars tends to be quite armored around themselves, and a sharp tongue. Mars can weaponize whatever it touches, and in this case, Mercury, it's like the weaponization of words, attacking, being able to hurt the other person through either understanding their psychology and piercing through that, stabbing them, wounding them, to kind of in a reactionary get you back, gotcha, or you hurt me, now I'm going to hurt you. So we want to think about, okay, if we have Mercury Mars, we know that that's a shadow aspect universally. It's not personal. And then we go, what ways might I be doing that? Can I own that? Can I see that? Can I own that? And then this is what I'm encouraging all of us to do, is to know better and do better, which is, okay, if I know that I have that aspect and that's the shadow expression, and this is how it comes out for me, is there a way that I can redirect that energy so it's not hurtful or harmful to myself or to the other people in my life? In the tarot, you get this with the cruelty card in the Crowley deck. And the cruelty card actually has a lot first to do with self-cruelty. So the Mercury Mars person has a tendency at first internally to attack themselves. And then there can often be a either projection that they perceive other people are attacking them when they're talking in conversation, or they're already on the defense before they enter into a conversation. And so that defensiveness comes across as antagonistic. And that antagonism usually elicits a fight or a harsh conversation with the other person. And so what I'm suggesting there is, if we know this is the tendency, is there a way the Mercury and Mars could be used and to to write or to channel it into a place where you can think fast and talk fast and spitball and banter with a friend, or do playful bantering with your partner, but demarcate the space. When I want to go into a more aggressive space with my partner, I try, whenever I'm conscious of it, which isn't always possible, but when it is, to say like, hey, I feel aggressive right now. I'm wondering if we could play fight, or I'm wondering if it's okay if we banter. And then like start and stop that space so that it's contained, instead of it being the everyday way of relating, which over time compounds hurtfulness. And then we're getting into that tit for tat place. Or when we get angry and lose our temper, and this is also what we see in the shadow expression of any aspect when we're dysregulated. So when we get angry, we lose our temper with Mercury and Mars, we can become really mean and again, very hurtful with our words. Okay. Uh, that one's clearly very activating for me. So moving on to Mercury Jupiter, the shadow expression here has a lot to do with exaggerating one's words. Mercury Jupiter is the aspect of the storyteller. So when this person goes to share a story, the shadow expression is like exaggerating what happened. That's that classic, like the fish started off this big and then it got this big. That's a very Mercury Jupiter tendency, is to inflate the narrative, or to inflate the details, or to inflate the facts to make the story better or more interesting or more appealing, to get that attention, but also at times to make oneself look better, that we did better than we actually did. And there's a sense of Jupiterian pride that can come through, where in the shadow Mercury Jupiter, it's like we want to be seen as successful, or we want to be seen as important. And so the tendency to exaggerate things in order to make oneself look bigger and better, or more successful or accomplished than one is. Also, Mercury Jupiter has a tendency to be hubristic. Jupiter inflates whatever it touches. And in this case, with Mercury, the mind, someone who has Mercury Jupiter can come across as hubristic, righteous. There's also a soapboxy energy, pontificating energy that we get there as well. This is someone that really thinks that potentially like their philosophical or metaphysical take on things is the way, that their philosophies are distorted opinions. And sometimes Mercury Jupiter, also like Sun Mercury, can come across as a know-it-all, or someone who like maybe read an article but presents the knowledge that they acquired in that article as if they did a lot more in-depth research than that. Like they read a whole book or they read the whole canon, but really they, chat GTP'd something. And there's nothing wrong with that. But again, it's that inflation of looking like one did more than they did. And so there's a grandiosity in one's communication. Also, like overstating things. So, for example, like it was so amazing, or it was so great, or it was the most amazing thing ever. I mean, and it's like everything's great, everything's amazing. Wow, wow, wow. Also, Mercury Jupiter can be like inappropriate laughter, like laughing at things in moments where it's like, oh, is that really an appropriate moment to be laughing? It also can be someone where there is a bypassing into positive psychology, where they just want to see the good things and not look at the bad things, or they just want to show up for the good things in life, but not actually for the hard things and the real things. And so Mercury Jupiter can be someone that kind of psychologically does bypassing into positive thinking, or like the shadow side of what's that called? Manifestation, where you make your own reality, and you attract into yourself. You create your own reality and you attract into yourself what you put out. Sometimes Mercury, Jupiter can kind of go into, well, if I just think positively and look at the good things, then only good things will happen. Okay, Mercury, Saturn. The shadow side of Mercury, Saturn is someone who's super ego and inner critic can be very dominant in not only their self-talk, but how they talk to others. There's a tendency to talk about negative things or to be hypercritical of other people and situations. So focusing on the bad, focusing on the negative, being very judgmental in one's communication, coming across as condemning or punitive, someone that when they think they know what is right, then they can come across as very harsh and pointed in their critical, judgmental nature of the situation. And at times it can really lack warmth and compassion. It can come across as very cold and potentially detached. It can also come across as very like authoritative communication, like someone who wants to tell you what to do, that they think they know best, and therefore they're going to, in an authoritative way, tell you what's right, tell you what's wrong, tell you what to do. It's very kind of, in its shadow form, compliance-based thinking. So very rule-based, what's right, what's wrong, as if that is some kind of creed or black and white thinking. And we see this also with shadow expressions in the chart, is whenever there's black and white thinking, we're in a shadow expression. That's that psychological splitting. And so with Mercury, Saturn, it's like this sense of moral condemnation. You can think here of like fundamentalism. I think anything that is fundamental or dogmatic can have that Mercury, Saturn quality to it. That black and white thinking of this is right, this is wrong, and it loses nuance and it loses liminality. And so it can come across as yeah, condemnation. I think internally, psychologically, because Mercury is our psychology and our self-talk, is the inner critic can be more pronounced, but it's like this tendency to get into these thought loops where we're stuck mentally in replaying things over and over again, or stuck in negative self-talk, and can be very like narrow thinking that loses sight of the larger picture. Um, okay, Mercury, Uranus, we're getting there. We're in the outer planets now. So Mercury, Uranus, in its shadow expression, can be someone that heads in the clouds, someone that is kind of detached or aloof in their thoughts. It's someone that is perhaps either more prone to disassociation or to kind of flights of fancy, like very much getting kind of taken into these, high ideas, but is ungrounded in their thinking. Like their feet aren't on the earth, they're not planted in this reality, they're off kind of in another world or outer space. It also is the aspect of inattentiveness, someone where their attention span is short, because they're thinking so quickly and they're constantly jumping to the next thing, or from one thing to another, or a bunch of tabs open in the mind. There can be this kind of skipping over things and missing, the whole story, or missing the details. It's someone whose mind is so quick that sometimes there can be a skipping over things. And so sometimes it can express itself in that aspect of Mercury, which has to do with listening as much as speaking, that there's an inattentiveness to listening at times, and really taking in what the other person is saying, slowing down enough to take in and really listen. So the Mercury Uranus kind of impulsive mind that at times can be erratic or chaotic, it can kind of, when dysregulated, get caught into a swirling energy of overstimulation. And so oftentimes the Mercury Uranus person knows they're dysregulated when they are overstimulating themselves with like a bunch of podcasts, a bunch of books, the TV's on, the radio's on, the radio. They're listening to music, they're reading a book, they have the computer open, they're taking that phone call. It's like everything is all over the place and it's a hyper stimulation when actually what's needed is like a de-escalation. And so it's someone that often can seek like high sensory experience. And there's nothing wrong in itself with that, except that when that person's dysregulated, it can end up becoming really frenetic and it can make the nervous system electrified. And then one's communication becomes unclear. It becomes sporadic or disjointed. So someone who doesn't finish their sentences, someone that doesn't finish the idea, someone that thinks what they're thinking in their mind, but they're not actually taking the time to explain it and they're hopping between ideas. And so then you can't really follow them anymore in what they're saying. Someone who lacks patience to finish the book, someone who lacks patience to finish the podcast, someone who lacks patience to fully listen to what the other person is saying before jumping to conclusions and thinking or predicting that they know what they're going to say next. It's also someone who can interrupt a lot. Okay. And forgetfulness. Okay. Mercury, Neptune. Mercury, Neptune in its shadow expression, I'm just going to go right for it there, can be a pathological liar. Like in its real extreme expression, Mercury, Neptune is someone that is constantly lying, constantly distorting the truth. Now, that's an extreme. I'm going to dial it back a little bit. Mercury, Neptune is someone in its shadow expression that can be quite delusional in their thoughts. They are, out of all the Mercury aspects, the most prone to projecting their fantasy or their ideal onto a situation. It's very much the aspect of seeing life through rose-colored glasses. It's definitely the aspect of not wanting to see all of reality, but just wanting to see the parts that you're wanting to see. Mercury, Neptune is someone who tends to daydream a lot and live in fantasy a lot. And so oftentimes that person can be living in whole worlds that, especially when it comes to relationship with other people, is not consensual. It's a tendency to not live in consensual reality. And so living in a delusion or living in a fantasy or living in a projection and not actually checking in with the other person to see if it's a shared experience. In those rose-colored glasses, a Mercury Neptune person is more prone to, in the delusions and illusions that they're in, think that they're in love with someone and that it's mutual, or think that the other person is having the same experience in whatever way that they are, when actually that's not the case at all. Mercury, Neptune also has a tendency to escape from reality into, fiction, film, movie as a coping mechanism to avoid dealing with reality, especially when reality is hard. So when reality is hard, there's an escapist tendency that also can be quite addictive. I mean, every aspect has like its addictive expression, but in this case, Mercury Neptune very much can be like the addiction to numb out the mind, to numb out from thinking, from numbing out from self-reflection, because it just feels too hard or too bad or too much. So it can in its, and I know that this is the first time I'm using the word pathological, which I usually don't use, but I do think it has a place in the shadow, and does, I think, have a place in the human condition where there can be this pathological expression of the combination. And in this case, it can be just an incredible distortion um, of reality that is um, very disconnected from, again, that like shared consensual experience between people. Okay, lastly, Mercury Pluto. Mercury Pluto in its shadow expression, and this is interesting because archetypally Pluto relates so much to the unconscious and to the shadow in the archetypal pantheon. And so Mercury Pluto is someone that, when being unconscious, can be truly very, very unconscious of the ways in which they're speaking and the effect that that has on the people around them. It can be someone who is more prone to paranoid thoughts and paranoid thinking. It can be someone that um, tends to think that like more subterranean or subliminal things are happening than perhaps they actually are. It's like an overreading into the depth of the experience and making meaning out of it, or interpreting motives from other people that perhaps aren't actually there, especially when that person is in a more distorted place. The tendency is to think that people are doing things from a more intentional and or harmful place than they actually are conscious of. In that paranoid thinking, it also is someone that can be unaware of the fact that when they're using their words, they're being manipulative or coercive. Even the word persuasive fits here. I, I have Mercury sextile Pluto, but Pluto is strong in my chart. And I remember one time a friend of mine said to me, "You're very persuasive." And I didn't like that. I thought, I don't want to be persuasive with my friends. I think persuasiveness has a place. But with my friends, I don't want to be persuasive. I want everyone to choose to do what they're doing because they genuinely want to do it, not because I'm having to convince them to do it or persuade them to do it. Mercury Pluto can be truth serum, the truth teller, but it also can be the secret keeper. That sword cuts both ways. And so Mercury Pluto can sometimes be the person that, especially as a child, the secrets were told to them and they became identified in part that their worth was keeping people's secrets, or being secretive in and of themselves. Mercury Pluto people tend to be secretive or be more hidden and veiled in their communication and in their sharing, oftentimes because there can be some shame there. And we want to think about this too in relationship to the shadows. Like wherever there is shame, we're more likely to distort. And so with Mercury Pluto, sometimes there can be shame around one's sexuality. There can be shame around one's sexual fantasies or sexual turn-ons that can be difficult to communicate in the bedroom or in any kind of sexual experiences. Mercury Pluto can also be more prone to dark thoughts and feeling even kind of like possessed by one's thoughts. It's quite prone to invasive or intrusive thoughts that are more dark, that can sometimes be scary for people, that are even terrifying. especially when you can't make them stop or you don't like the content of those thoughts. It's also a tendency to be more tapped into the unconscious. And so sometimes it feels like your thoughts um, are your own and deeply personal when actually they're either coming from your unconscious or the collective unconscious. And then thinking that, it says something about you when really you're kind of maybe just tapping into like a thought form that isn't actually yours or just is needing to pass through. And so sometimes Mercury can hook on to in the mind into the content that it's thinking about. And with Mercury Pluto, the hook there can be sometimes apocalyptic, thinking that the world's going to end or your world's going to end or things are worse than they actually are. And kind of getting consumed in obsessive, compulsive thoughts that aren't actually serving you. Okay, wow, that was a little intense going through the shadow expression of Mercury with all of the planets. But I wanted to do it because, and I want to take a moment to tap into why I wanted to do this here. Um, the world's a really hard place right now. And I think our words matter. I think that when we can know better, we can do better. And I think that a huge thing that psychology and astrology afford us is knowing better so we can do better. And so when we get that distance, that perspective on our chart, and we can look at it as if it wasn't our own and say, like, how would we interpret this if this was not our birth chart? And knowing the light and shadow expression of a combination and knowing the shadow expression in this case and saying, like, yeah, I know this is the shadow expression of this combination, irregardless of, what person this belongs to. And so therefore, when I know the shadow expression of combinations in my chart, what one small thing can I do to do better in my life? In this case, around my communication, when I know that maybe I'm triggered or I'm dysregulated or I'm having a bad day or I'm not feeling the best or I'm stressed out, like to know that the shadow expression is more likely to come out during those times. Or if you with other people in your life, people who haven't gone down the journey of being in therapy or learning astrology or doing any kind of self-healing and they're in a place of hatred. When you encounter people who are in their hatred, it's like to look at it through that lens and say, wow, that's a really clear shadow expression of someone who clearly is suffering and is spending time in hatred instead of healing. And to bring that compassion to ourselves when a shadow expression of our chart does come out, and when we are able to catch it or a loved one in our life catches it, when our partners catch it, when our children catch it, when a friend catches it and brings it to our attention, for us to go, oh, yeah, that's a real shadow expression of Mercury, Neptune, or of Mercury, Venus. And I can own that because I know that that's true. And I know that that's true about me. And like, I'm going to apologize and I'm going to say I'm sorry and I'm going to own it. And then I'm going to like just try to do better next time. Not to be perfect, not to get it right, but just to try a little bit better in our relationships and in our own self-talk. I'm trying these days to really catch myself whenever I'm being overly critical of myself and just say, oh, it's okay. You got a lot going on. You're doing your best. You're learning, you're growing, you're making mistakes, and that's okay. So, the intention of this video today is really just to both say, wow, isn't that incredible that we can look at astrology and look at the shadow and therefore look at our own shadow and know what we've learned from psychology about the unconscious and about distortion and dysregulation and combine that all together and just do a little bit better for the sake of each other and this world. Thank you so much for being here with me. If you like this video, I'd love for you to like it, leave a comment. I always respond. And the greatest compliment you can give me is to subscribe to this channel, to come live astrology with us here at Trust Psyche in any way that feels right to you. You can always come follow me on Instagram at trust.psyche. I post really often there. I'm loving it. It's fun, it's playful, and I'm just so grateful to be here with you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for being awesome, and I'll see you next time.